Story 1. It was an early December night, and I was at home, enjoying a day off indoors by the fireplace. The weather outside was just too cold and snowy for my liking. I tackled some chores around the house, but mostly it was a pretty laid-back day. The news was on in the background, reporting high winds and potential blizzards starting that evening. By 5 o'clock, I could already tell things were getting worse outside. I settled on the couch and flipped to another channel. Around 7, I heard the wind really start to howl against the house. It genuinely sounded like a full-blown blizzard. I got up and peered out the window facing my backyard to check the conditions. Initially, all I saw was a blur of snow hitting the ground, making visibility almost zero. But then I noticed something else, a figure walking through my yard. My backyard was quite large and unfenced, so a person wouldn't have been entirely out of place, if not for the raging blizzard. Whoever it was just kept walking at a steady pace toward the far end of my property before the heavy snow and darkness swallowed them from sight. I stayed at the window for another minute, trying to catch one last glimpse and figure out what they were doing, but I saw nothing. I was honestly worried for them, yet I couldn't grasp why anyone would be out there at all. The part of my yard they were headed toward led to a road, but it wouldn't take them anywhere for miles. Definitely not walkable in that weather. I went back to the TV, but the image of the person stuck with me. Just 5 minutes later, there was a knock at my front door. I went over and carefully opened it a crack. Standing there was a man in a heavy winter jacket. His nose was bright red, and his face was pale, as if he'd been exposed to the bitter cold for quite some time. I couldn't be certain if this was the same person I'd seen in my backyard, but my gut feeling said it was. "How can I help you?" I asked. The man offered a weak smile and, his teeth chattering, explained he was waiting for a ride, and asked if he could come inside for a few minutes to escape the cold until it arrived. I paused before answering, actually considering his request given the severe weather. It's easy to say you'd never let a stranger into your house, but when someone appears to be freezing to death on your doorstep, asking for help, the decision isn't so simple. I told him he could wait on my porch, which had an overhang that kept the snow out, and offered him an old jacket of mine if he needed it. The man didn't look thrilled, but he just nodded, moved to the side and sat on a chair I had out there. I closed and locked the door, then headed upstairs to get my old jacket. It was far too big for me, and in rough shape, but that wouldn't matter in a situation like this. I grabbed it and came back downstairs, about to unlock the door and open it, but something made me stop right before I did. I don't know what it was, but I hesitated. I leaned over and peered through the peephole. The man was now standing pressed right against the door, his hand on the handle, as if he was ready to push it open the moment I unlocked it. My heart began to pound. I took a couple of steps back and quietly pulled out my phone to dial 9. As I whispered into the phone, I just stared wide-eyed at the door, dreading what might be waiting on the other side. Once the police confirmed they were on their way, I slowly crept back to the peephole and looked out again. The man wasn't there. Not on my porch, not anywhere in my front yard. He was simply gone, as if he knew I had called the police. Nothing else was discovered that night, and there were never any further signs of him. What he would have done if I'd opened that door, I can't be sure, but I can only hope he never comes back. Story 2. This happened last January. After New Year's, I'd taken a week off work, hoping that everyone else would be back at their jobs, leaving me to enjoy a quiet week without crowded places. My plans mostly involved shopping and just relaxing by myself at my apartment. On this particular day, I was driving around in the snow, visiting a few stores, and then headed back home, arriving by 7:00 p.m. I got inside, got comfortable, and settled onto the couch with some snacks I'd just bought. I was watching TV, even dozing off a little from my long day out. But then around 8:30, the intercom in my apartment buzzed. That meant someone was outside, wanting me to let them into the building. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I had no idea who it could be. They buzzed my room again, so I got up and went to the window that faced the front of the building. I tried to lift the blinds just enough to see who was at the apartment complex door, without revealing too much. Standing at the entrance was a large man. It was still snowy and pretty dark, but I could tell he was older, maybe mid-40s. I'd never seen him before. At the time, only 3 other people lived in the complex, so I was at least familiar with the residents, and he wasn't one of them. I also figured that if he lived there or was visiting someone, they would have let him in themselves. I walked over to the intercom and muted it, then went back to the couch and continued watching TV. I didn't really give it any more thought, and even dozed off a few times over the next hour. Eventually, I turned off the TV and went to bed. It must have been around 10 p.m. by then. I fell asleep almost instantly. A few hours into the night, my eyes snapped open to a loud thud coming from right outside my room. It was incredibly jarring, but having just woken up, I couldn't tell what it was or exactly where it came from. My heart pounded as I stared across the room at my door, listening for any other sounds. It was completely quiet now, almost as if nothing had happened. I got out of bed and slowly moved toward the door, then pressed my ear against it to listen to the other side. Still silence, only the usual creaking of the building's walls. I turned the handle and peered out into the living room, seeing nothing out of the ordinary. The whole place was really dark though, and for some reason, I still felt a need to be quiet and not make my presence known. So I left the lights off as I moved through the living room and looked down the front hallway. The door to my apartment was wide open. I froze, staring at the open doorway, a wave of fear washing over my entire body. It almost didn't feel real. I took a few steps back, staying quiet, and retreated toward my room. Now, on the outside of my bedroom door, I could see a huge dent in the wood right by the knob. As soon as I saw that, I rushed in and locked the door behind me, then called 911. I was convinced that whoever it was had to still be inside my apartment, and it was only a matter of time before they got into my room. But as I waited for the police, the apartment remained silent. Whoever had broken in was gone. Even the police couldn't find anything to help track them down. Their theory was that the intruder had tried buzzing all the other rooms too, until one resident was kind enough to let them into the building. Once inside the main stairwell, it's not clear why they chose my room. Maybe thinking it was empty. What's really strange is the dent on my bedroom door, which was likely the source of the thud that woke me up. But it was just one single hit, not looking like a real attempt to break the door down, but more like something done out of frustration before leaving. I still live in the same apartment, and nothing else has ever happened. Who it was and what they wanted remains unknown. Story 3. I've been a land surveyor for nearly 2 decades, and in that time, I've worked in some truly isolated environments. I've witnessed everything: wild creatures, unpredictable weather, and equipment malfunctions far from civilization. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered beneath that bridge in the Arizona desert. It's the kind of experience that lingers, subtly unsettling, a constant reminder that in truly remote areas, you are utterly alone. It was the middle of July, a day when the heat pressed down like a physical weight, and the sun seemed determined to scorch everything. The Arizona desert stretched out endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of sand, rocks, and sparse vegetation, broken only by the occasional cactus. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless azure, the kind of blue that appears to extend into infinity. My assignment was to inspect a bridge that spanned a dry riverbed, approximately 80 kilometers outside of Phoenix. It wasn't a glamorous task, but it was straightforward: assess its structural integrity, measure wear and tear, and confirm it met current standards. The bridge itself was ancient, likely constructed in the 1960s, and had seen minimal traffic in recent years. It was remote, far from any town or major road, which made it ideal for someone like me who preferred working solo. I drove my vehicle down a dusty, narrow track that meandered through the desert, the tires kicking up plumes of red soil in my way. The radio crackled with static, the signal fading in and out as I moved further from civilization. I didn't mind the quiet, however. In fact, I savored it. Out here, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. I reached the bridge around midday, the sun high in the sky, baking the earth below. I parked my truck by the side of the track, retrieved my equipment, and commenced the routine inspection. The bridge appeared quite dilapidated, rusted metal beams, fissures in the concrete, and a layer of dust and grime that hadn't been disturbed in years. As I moved underneath the bridge to examine the supports, I noticed something peculiar, a large refuse container tucked away in the shadows beneath the structure. It was an odd sight, completely out of place in the middle of the desert. I couldn't fathom why anyone would leave a dumpster out here, especially in such a secluded spot. Curiosity compelled me to investigate further. The container was old and battered, covered in rust and graffiti. A faint, unpleasant odor emanated from it, like something had been decaying inside for a considerable time. I hesitated for a moment, then carefully lifted the lid, half expecting to find nothing but old rubbish. What I saw instead sent a chill down my spine. Inside the dumpster were heaps of tattered clothing, dirty blankets, and what appeared to be empty food containers. It was clear someone had been living here, using the container as a makeshift shelter. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. Strange, crude drawings, scratched into the metal walls. They depicted distorted faces, twisted figures, and symbols I didn't recognize. My initial thought was that some drifter had taken up residence here, someone down on their luck, using this desolate spot as a place to hide from the world. It wasn't uncommon to encounter makeshift camps in remote areas, but this felt different, more desperate, more deranged. I retreated from the container, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd seen enough. I simply wanted to complete my inspection and leave. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me, concentrating on the task at hand. But as I worked, I couldn't help but glance back at the refuse container, half expecting to see someone emerge from the shadows. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing, as the footsteps grew louder, close. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from the bridge to the surrounding desert, but saw no one. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was only the wind whistling through the dry riverbed. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A figure stepped out from behind the container. A man, his clothes filthy and ragged, his hair wild and matted. He was tall, gaunt, with a wild glint in his eyes. He stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable, then began to move toward me. My heart leaped into my throat. I didn't know what this individual wanted, but I knew I didn't want to stay to find out. I quickly backed away, attempting to maintain some distance between us, but he kept advancing, his pace quickening with every step. I called out, my voice quivering despite my efforts to remain calm. "I'm just doing my job here. I'll be out of your way in a minute." But he didn't respond. His eyes were fixated on me, and there was something in his gaze that sent a wave of terror through me. Something feral, unhinged, as if he was barely clinging to sanity. My mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. My truck was parked a few yards away, but the man was between me and it. I didn't want to turn my back on him, but I knew I couldn't remain here. The survey, the job, none of that mattered anymore. All I cared about was getting out of there in one piece. Then he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "This is my place," he said, his words slurred and broken. "You shouldn't be here." "I'm sorry," I replied, keeping my tone as calm as I could. "I didn't know. I'll leave right now, okay?" But he didn't stop. He kept coming, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, his eyes wild with an emotion I couldn't interpret. I took another step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The distance between us was rapidly closing, and I knew I had to act. Without thinking, I reached for the sidearm I kept holstered at my hip, a precaution I always took when working in remote areas. My hand shook as I drew it, and aimed it at the man, my finger hovering over the trigger. "Stop," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Don't come any closer." The man froze, his eyes widening as he saw the weapon. For a moment, I thought he might retreat, that he might recognize the situation had escalated too far. But then he did something I didn't anticipate. He smiled, a twisted, unsettling grin that sent chills down my spine. "You think that's going to help?" he sneered, taking another step forward. "Out here, you're just as alone as I am." I didn't wait to discover what he meant by that. I fired a warning shot into the ground at his feet, the sound reverberating through the empty desert. The man flinched, but he didn't. He kept advancing, his smile broadening, his eyes gleaming with some dark intention. Panic surged through me. I knew I couldn't take my eyes off him, but I also knew I couldn't stay here. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and made a dash for it. I sprinted toward my truck, not daring to look back, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached the truck, yanked the door open, and hurled myself inside. My hands fumbled with the keys, but I finally managed to start the engine. As I slammed the door shut, I caught one last glimpse of the man standing by the refuse container, watching me with that same unsettling smile. I floored the accelerator and sped down the dusty road, the tires kicking up clouds of sand behind me. I didn't stop until I was kilometers away, the bridge nothing but a distant memory in the rearview mirror. I never returned to that site. I reported the incident to my supervisor, who dispatched someone else to complete the task. I don't know what became of the man under the bridge, and I have no desire to know. All I know is that I came too close to something sinister, something that could have concluded very differently. Even now, I still reflect on that day. I still see the man's face, that twisted smile in my nightmares. And every time I find myself in a remote area, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, waiting. The experience beneath that bridge taught me a lesson I'll never forget. When you're alone in the middle of nowhere, you're vulnerable in ways you can't fathom. The isolation, the emptiness, it plays tricks on your mind, makes you question what's real and what isn't. And sometimes you encounter things that remind you just how fragile the line between safety and danger truly is. So if you ever find yourself far from civilization, remember this story. Remain vigilant, stay cautious, and most importantly, stay safe. Because out there you're on your own, and you never know what might be lurking just beyond sight. Story 4. I've stayed in all sorts of roadside lodgings over the years, from quaint and charming to dilapidated and dubious. But there's one establishment I frequented a few years back that I'll never forget. It was a small, isolated place off a desolate stretch of road in the middle of nowhere. I hadn't intended to stop there, but after driving for hours with no sign of human habitation, I had little choice. I simply needed a place to rest for the night. What I discovered instead was a nightmare that still haunts me. I'd been driving for hours, attempting to reach the next town before calling it a night, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly, winding through kilometers of empty fields and forests. My car's headlights barely pierced the darkness, the occasional signpost or abandoned barn the only indications I was still on the correct route. When I finally spotted the flickering neon sign for the motel, a wave of relief washed over me. It wasn't much. A small single-story building with a handful of rooms, a few old vehicles parked out front, and a faded sign that read vacancy in dim, sputtering letters. The place looked as though it hadn't been updated in decades. Paint peeling from the walls, windows grimy and cracked. But I was too exhausted to care. I just needed a place to sleep, somewhere to rest my head before continuing my journey in the morning. I pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching under the car as I parked. The air was cold, the sky overcast, and a faint mist hung in the air, clinging to everything like a damp shroud. The only light came from the neon sign and a single bulb above the motel's entrance, casting an eerie yellow glow on the worn-out pavement. I grabbed my bag and went inside, the door groaning on its hinges as I pushed it open. The lobby was small and dreary, with faded wallpaper and a few outdated brochures scattered on a dusty counter. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, his eyes barely visible behind thick, smudged spectacles. He looked up as I entered, his expression blank, almost detached. "Need a room?" I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The old man didn't say anything at first, just stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. He reached under the counter and produced a worn, leather-bound register, flipping it open to a blank page. His hands trembled slightly as he handed me a pen. "Sign here," he mumbled, his voice gravelly and low. I scrawled my name in the register and returned it to him. He didn't even glance at it, simply pushed it aside and reached for a key hanging on a hook behind the counter. "Room 6, he said, sliding the key across the counter. "Smoking. No pets." "Got it. Got it," I replied, taking the key. "Thanks." He didn't respond, just stared at me with that same vacant expression as I turned and headed back outside. Room 6 was at the far end of the building, adjacent to a thick line of trees that bordered the property. The door was old and chipped, the number barely visible, but the key turned easily enough in the lock. The room inside was about what I expected. Small, with a sagging bed, a rickety chest of drawers, and a tiny television mounted on the wall. The carpet was stained, the wallpaper peeling, and the entire place smelled faintly of mildew. But it was warm, and after the long drive it was sufficient. I tossed my bag on the bed and sat down, the mattress groaning under my weight. I grabbed the remote and flicked on the TV, but all I got was static. Sighing, I turned it off and glanced around the room, noticing a small door to the side that I assumed led to the bathroom. I walked over and pushed it open, revealing a cramped, outdated bathroom with a cracked mirror and a flickering overhead light. After freshening up, I changed into some comfortable clothes and climbed into bed, pulling the thin blankets up to my chin. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the highway. I turned off the lamp beside the bed and closed my eyes, trying to let the day's exhaustion take over. But sleep did not come easy. The darkness felt oppressive, the silence too complete, as if the world outside the room had ceased to exist. I tossed and turned, trying to get comfortable, but an uneasy feeling gnawed at the back of my mind. Something about the motel, about the old man behind the counter, about the entire place felt wrong. Just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from outside the room. It was a faint noise like something gently tapping against the door. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up in bed, straining to listen. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a branch from one of the nearby trees brushing against the door. But the sound was too deliberate, too steady. It wasn't random, it was intentional. I felt a chill run down my spine, and my hands shook as I reached for the lamp. The light flickered on. I stared at the door, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound still echoing in my ear. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to see what was causing the noise, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I did. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet meeting the cold floor. I crept toward the door, my breath shallow, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop, to turn back, but I didn't. I reached the door and placed my hand on the cold doorknob, hesitating for just a moment before turning it and pulling the door open. The night air rushed in, cold and damp, but there was nothing there, just the empty parking lot, the gravel gleaming faintly in the light of the distant neon sign. I stepped outside, the gravel crunching under my feet, and looked around. The mist hung low to the ground, making everything appear ghostly, unreal. There was no one there, no sign of anything, or anyone that could have made the sound. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease. Maybe it really was just the wind, or perhaps I was more tired than I realized. I was about to turn back into the room when I noticed something. A single footprint in the gravel, just a few feet from the door. It wasn't mine. The print was large, its outline clear in the mist-covered gravel, and it led away from the room, disappearing into the line of trees at the edge of the property. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly retreated back into the room, slamming the door behind me and locking it securely. I pressed my back against the door, my mind racing. Someone had been out there, standing just outside my room. But where had they gone, and why were they just standing there, tapping on the door? I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just some eccentric messing around, maybe one of the other guests playing a prank. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something disturbing about the whole situation, something that made my skin crawl. I crawled back into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin, but there was no way I was going to sleep now. I lay there in the dark, staring at the door. The hours seemed to stretch on forever, the silence in the room, thick and suffocating. Then just as I was starting to think I'd imagined the entire thing, I heard it again. This time it was coming from the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The window was right next to the bed, covered by a thin curtain that barely blocked out the light. The sound was soft, almost like someone gently tapping on the glass with their fingernails. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was out there. But the sound continued, persistent, rhythmic, like it was trying to draw me closer, trying to get me to look. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the blankets over my head like a child hiding from a monster under the bed. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just my imagination, that if I stayed still, stayed quiet, it would go away. But the tapping didn't stop. The room felt like a prison, the walls closing in around me. I was trapped. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and I knew I couldn't just lie there and do nothing. With a trembling hand, I reached out and grabbed the torch from the nightstand. I took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage to look, to see what was outside the window. I slowly pulled the blankets down, the torch clutched tightly in my hand. I shone the torch at the window, the beam casting a faint glow on the thin curtain. I could see a vague shape behind it, something standing just outside the glass, barely visible. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out with my free hand, gripping the edge of the curtain. I hesitated for just a moment, then yanked it aside, the torch beam illuminating the window. There was nothing there, no figure, no face, no sign of anything that could have been making the noise. Just the empty parking lot, the mist swirling in the faint light of the neon sign. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still raced. I was about to close the curtain when I noticed something small, barely visible in the corner of the window. A handprint, smudged and faint, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. The handprint was on the inside of the glass. Panic surged through me. I stumbled back from the window, the torch slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. I grabbed my keys, my bag, anything I could reach, and bolted for the door. I didn't care about checking out, didn't care about anything, except getting the hell out of there. I fumbled with the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the knob. Finally, I managed to wrench it open and ran out into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was in the car, the engine roaring to life. As I tore out of the parking lot, gravel spraying behind me. I drove for hours, the lights of civilization finally bringing some semblance of safety. I found a different motel there, one that was clean and well lit, and checked in without a second thought. But even then, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that handprint in my mind, kept hearing that soft rhythmic tapping. I never found out what happened that night, never returned to that motel to discover who or what was outside my room. I've recounted it to a few people, but most just laugh it off, saying it was probably just my imagination, or some mischievous individual playing a prank. But I know what I heard, what I saw, and I know that whatever was out there, it wasn't just my imagination. I've spent a lot of time on the road since then, stayed in many motels, but I always make sure to find a place that's well lit, that's near other people, and I never ever stop at some lonely, isolated place in the middle of nowhere, because out there, in the darkness, in the silence, there's something waiting, something that will find you if you're not careful, and once it does, you may never escape. If these narratives sent shivers down your spine, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more unsettling accounts. Share your own strange encounters in the comments. I'd be interested to hear what keeps you awake at night. And don't forget to activate the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thank you for watching, and remember, the most terrifying locations are often where you least expect them. Stay vigilant out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Story 5. It was a snowy night when I pulled into the gas station parking lot for my overnight 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. I'd been at this job for several months, and while I really didn't enjoy it, finding other work was tough. Plus, the night shifts fit best with other parts of my life. Still, I dragged myself in tired every night and struggled through each shift. I parked in front of the building, next to my coworker's car, the only other one in the lot. I went inside and relieved him. He left a couple of minutes later, and then it was just me for the rest of the night. My manager had left a paper on the desk with a list of tasks, but after reading it, I realized it wasn't much. I guessed it would take no more than an hour to complete everything, so I tried to put it off as long as possible. My plan was to save the tasks for when I started getting really tired, hoping it would keep me awake. But as I sat there behind the desks, somewhere around midnight, a car pulled into the station. I glanced out the window, seeing an old SUV parked by one of the pumps. Of course, with it snowing, most people weren't out driving, but getting a customer now and then was normal. I went back to my phone, scrolling through videos, not paying much attention for about 10 minutes. Then I looked outside again and saw the SUV was still by the pump. The headlights were off and the doors were closed. It looked like they should be pumping gas, but it had been so long. I stood up and got closer to the window, looking down both sides of the building, but nobody was outside. If they'd been in their car with the engine off for the past 10 minutes, they'd have to be freezing. It was snowy, windy, and cold, so I honestly started to get a little nervous for them. I paid closer attention for the next few minutes, waiting to see any movement through the dark windows, or for someone to get back inside their car. But there was nothing. It was like the car was just abandoned right next to the pump. After some thought, I put on my jacket and went outside. Immediately, I knew I was right. It was far too cold for anyone to be in there with the car off, or for anyone to even be outside for more than a few minutes. I rushed over to the car and looked around, then pressed my face close to the window and tried to peer inside. "Hello? Anyone in there? Just checking to see if you're okay." I called out, but from what I could see, there wasn't anyone inside. It wasn't exactly easy to see, so someone could have been, but I was pretty sure no one was there. Now, even more confused, I backed up and looked around at the empty gas station parking lot before starting to walk back. With my eyes no longer focused on the car, I was just looking at the ground and noticed shoe prints in the snow heading toward the building. Not really the front, but off to the side. I looked back and saw they seemed to come from the car, but at this point I was freezing and didn't want to investigate further without warming up a bit first. I hurried inside and turned on the small heater next to the counter, putting my hands in front of it to warm them up. I was only inside for maybe 30 seconds to a minute before a loud thump echoed through the building from behind me. I spun around, not seeing anything, then walked around the counter and toward the back. On the floor there were puddles of dirty water, like snow that had melted off someone's boots. Feeling a chill run through me, I stepped closer to the back room and turned the corner toward where the supply room was. Standing in the dark behind one of the shelves, I could see the outline of a figure. They were tall, with broad shoulders and a large, scruffy beard, and they were looking right at me. My heart stopped for a moment, but after the initial shock, my reaction was to just walk back to the counter. I don't know why. Maybe I was just too stunned to react appropriately. After staring at the doorway to the supply room for I don't even know how long, I quietly picked up the store phone and called the police, whispering for help. Then I endured the most unnerving 10 minutes of my life as I waited. During this time, I didn't hear or see anything from the supply room, which honestly just added to my fear for some reason. The man never came out to confront me. When 2 cops finally pulled in and came inside, I quietly told them where the man was. They searched the room while I stayed by the front, but I was shocked when they came out with nobody else. The man was gone. Watery shoe prints surrounded the back door, but outside were fresh tracks in the snow leading straight away from the gas station, straight into the completely dark, empty field that stretched for miles. Obviously nobody could search that at night, but even when they did in the following days, they didn't find anything. I mean, the field was huge. He could have gone anywhere, but it was so cold and windy that night that I was almost sure they'd find a body. The SUV was taken in, hopefully for more information. I don't know how or why, but for some reason they couldn't find any history of ownership. So that left us with just what we know from that night, and we are still left with just who the man was and what he was doing remains unsolved, and where he is now is just as much of a question. Story 6. I deliver pizzas for my local Papa John's. As a college student, it's one of the few jobs I could choose from. A few of my friends work here too, but since we're all delivery drivers, we don't really see each other, even on the same shifts. This particular incident happened last December, while I was picking up extra shifts before Christmas. That night, it was snowing quite a bit, making deliveries take longer than usual. Yet we were getting more orders than usual. I was never super stressed about work, but having to go non-stop for hours definitely wasn't the most enjoyable. At 9:30, I grabbed my next set of orders to deliver and got in my car to pull up the direction. I had 2 orders, and the houses were only 5 minutes apart, but both were pretty far from the shop. About 15 minutes away, which felt more like 25 minutes in this weather. The first part of the drive was normal, but then it started taking me toward a less visited section of town. The houses here were older, and most of the businesses in the area had shut down. Nobody really came around here unless they lived there, because it was so old and simply didn't meet modern standard. After 20 minutes of driving, I pulled into one of these neighborhoods and drove down the road toward the first house. The road felt very empty, with no cars parked along the side, and most of the houses looked somewhat abandoned. Once I reached the first address, I parked on the street and walked up to the front door. A kind old man answered, paid for the pizza, and then I went back to my car to set directions for the next house. It was in the same neighborhood, but I realized as I drove that it was taking me deeper in, to a point where there were fewer houses and more space between them. By the time I arrived at the address, I couldn't see any other houses around. It was just trees surrounding the area. Again, I parked on the street and walked up to the front door. I knocked and waited patiently on the porch. It was quite cold out, and the snow was soaking my clothes, which wasn't helping. Finally, after about a minute, the door opened. It was a middle-aged woman who looked like she'd just woken up. Her hair was messy, and her eyes were tired and emotionless. "I have your order here for 2 pizzas," I said, holding out the boxes and giving her the total. She took the boxes and placed them on a table next to her, then told me to wait a moment while she got cash. Another minute passed before she opened the door again. She started sifting through some cash, counting it slowly and trying to add it all up. There was definitely something weird about her. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what it was, but everything she was doing just felt very odd. Then, as if she wasn't struggling enough to count the cash, she started making small talk with me. Normal stuff like asking how my day was and all that. I responded politely, but it just felt really weird, like she was stalling. At some point while she was talking, I looked back at my car, just to mentally distance myself from the uncomfortable situation for a moment. But I quickly noticed a man standing right next to it. He was looking in the windows and doing something to the door. When I looked back at the woman, her face had contorted into anger. I realized what was happening too late though, as she reached out and grabbed me, then started yelling to the man by my car. He turned around and began sprinting toward us as the woman tried to pull me into the house. I pushed her away and broke free. My instincts took over, and I sprinted into the tree. I could hear the man's heavy footsteps crunching in the snow behind me all the way through the forest, until finally they started to fade away. After 2 minutes of sprinting, I stopped to catch my breath. Luckily, the moon was lighting up the forest enough for me to navigate through it and find my way back to one of the streets in the neighborhood. I called 911 once I got cell service, and after 10 minutes of waiting in the cold, an officer arrived. Another patrol car went to the house, finding the man outside, in the act of trying to break into my car. To keep things from dragging on, the motive was likely that the couple had run out of money and resorted to robbing my vehicle. The whole distraction was so the man could rob my car without me ever knowing. But since I saw what he was doing, it's not really clear what they would have done next. Maybe they would have just let me go, but it's obvious I would have reported them. So I don't think that's likely. I'm just thankful for getting away unharmed, and for being the first victim they tried this on before getting arrested, never getting the chance to do anything to anyone else. Story 7. This incident occurred last winter, in early February. I was driving for my next DoorDash delivery, feeling a bit tired, as I'd been on the road for the past 4 hours. It was almost midnight. After this delivery, I was definitely planning to call it a night and head home, worried about getting too sleepy behind the wheel, especially with all the ice and snow. I was driving down a fairly empty side road that connected two of our city's main towns. There was a 5-mile stretch along this road with absolutely nothing. No buildings, no houses, nowhere to stop. As I drove through this section, I don't really know what happened, but I was suddenly overcome by a wave of tiredness that made me lose focus on the road for just a few seconds. That's all it took, I guess. I hit a patch of ice and slid toward the side. Although I fully woke back up at that point, it was too late. I tried to steer back onto the road, but my car just slid straight off and into the small ditch between the road and the wood. It wasn't a bad crash at all, as the snow cushioned the impact, but it still left me a little shaky, and I immediately knew it would be impossible to get out. My car was stuck on the ditch's incline, buried in thick snow. I didn't even bother getting out to assess the damage, though I did try my luck maneuvering the car to gain some traction. If anything, I only made it worse. While trying to figure everything out, I noticed a car's headlights down the road. At first I thought it was just a car passing by, but after a few seconds, it was clear they weren't moving. Someone must have just been parked down the road with their headlights on, which I found a little unsettling, given the coincidence of it being on this long empty road. They weren't close enough to have stopped to help me, but they weren't far enough away not to see my headlights either. I pulled out my phone and called my dad, knowing he'd still be awake and hoping he could help me. I'd never been in a situation like this, so I really didn't know what to do. He said he would call roadside assistance and then drive down to wait with me. I thanked him and felt a sense of relief, knowing he'd be there in just a few minutes. I looked back out on the road, searching for the headlights of the car I'd just seen, but now they were gone. It was too dark to see anything that far without light, so I didn't know if they'd driven away or were still there and had just turned off their lights. The more I thought about it, the more it started to creep me out. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, not looking away for more than a few seconds, as I began to feel paranoid. The silence, too, made it more unsettling, only the wind outside my car and nothing else. Then after about 3 minutes of waiting, I saw a figure walking toward my car. He was down the road, coming from the direction where the headlights had been. I watched him as he slowly made his way through the snow, getting to about 15 feet from the front of my car. Then he stopped. He stood there in the snow, facing me but not moving. I couldn't see much of him because he had a hoodie covering his face, but the way he just stood there in my headlights started to terrify me. After a moment, I honked my horn softly a few times, just to let them know I was in the car and could see them. They still didn't move or acknowledge me. But just as I was pulling out my phone to call my dad again, the man turned around and walked away, disappearing down the road. I still called my dad to tell him about this really strange person out there, and he said he was just a minute away. I stayed on the phone with him this time, and only 30 seconds later, I saw headlights turn on down the road and begin moving toward my car. Once they were right across the road, they parked and turned off their light. I couldn't see over the ditch, but I heard a door open as I yelled into the phone, asking what was going on. But then my dad's car pulled right in front of my view and screeched to a stop. I heard him yell at someone as they got back in their car and sped away. They didn't come back, but my dad said the guy was holding something in his hands that looked like he was going to break into my car. Everything was okay after that though, and the car ended up not even having much damage to it. I'm not sure what was about to happen that night, but I know I'm really lucky to have not found out. Story 8. I work as a mechanic for a car shop in my town, a locally owned and operated repair business that started many years ago. The shop itself operates out of an old warehouse, and outside we have a collection of broken down cars and parts, which we affectionately call the Scrapyard. Most of it is just vehicles waiting for specific parts. For the past 2 years, my job has been to order and track stock moving in and out. And the best time to do this is when it's not busy. So overnight, I guess I also unofficially served as a security guard, because it wasn't uncommon for strange individuals or teenagers to hop the fence and try to tamper with or steal things from the scrapyard. On this particular night, I got to work at, chatted with my boss for a bit before he left, and then it was just me in the warehouse. It was raining outside, which made the inside of the building quite noisy, but also sort of calming. I went through my usual routine, checking the orders mechanics had sent in and seeing what had been used during the day. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but 2 cars needed very specific parts. And for one of them, the mechanic hadn't written down the model year, which can sometimes be really important. I got up from my desk and walked through the warehouse, looking for this gray Nissan Versa so I could confirm the correct part. But as I reached the end of the warehouse, I still hadn't found it. I sighed, knowing it had to be in the scrapyard. Of course, on the one day it was pouring rain. I went back to my desk, and after a quick coffee break, I grabbed my jacket and flashlight and headed to the back door. The rain seemed to have intensified since I was last outside, but in the distance, I could spot the car I was looking for, tucked away between a few other vehicles. I stepped out into the rain and started walking over, turning on my flashlight. As I got about to the center of the scrapyard, a sudden movement from something in front of me made me stop dead in my track. It was at the edge of my flashlight beam, and I wasn't really paying attention, but it looked like a person moving from behind one of the cars. The rain drowned out any sound I might have heard, so I just stood there, holding my flashlight up, waiting for more movement. "Hello? I saw you. Just get out of here," I yelled, hoping it was just some kid messing around. I took a few steps closer to where I'd seen them, and yelled again for them to leave the property. I didn't see anything, so I moved closer and started scanning the whole area. But whoever was there must have already left. Honestly, I was relieved that I didn't have to call the cops or do anything drastic. I quickly walked over to the Nissan, noted the model year, then jogged back to the warehouse and went inside. I took off my jacket and sat back at the desk, filling out the rest of the information and submitting the order. I spent another half hour there, processing more order requests, and then I had to do the stock counting in the main warehouse section of the building. By then it was probably 12:30 or 1 a.m. I walked along the shelves, checking what everyday products and parts had been used up. While making my way down the first set of shelves, a sudden thud resonated through the warehouse, and then the lights went out. I stood there, eyes wide open, staring into the dark abyss. I couldn't see anything, but amidst the sound of the rain hitting the roof, I could hear footsteps walking through the building. I stared in the direction the sound was coming from, and could immediately tell they were headed toward me. I didn't know what to do at this point. I was sure that whoever was in here had shut off the power, but why they were here I had no idea. And without any light, I couldn't even run away. All I could do was listen to their footsteps grow louder as I stared into the pitch black, hoping they didn't know where I was. They were only about 10 feet away when I heard them stop. After a moment, I heard a box open and things being shifted around before the footsteps began moving away. I had been holding my breath the entire time, and after 30 seconds, it was completely silent. I waited for a few more minutes before finally taking out my phone and calling 911, then using its flashlight to move toward the breaker room and flip the power switch back on. Looking through the warehouse with the police, all that was left were wet shoe prints going through the building and out the back door. It seemed like the person who was out in the scrapyard had probably slipped in while I was outside, and the door was still unlocked. Then they obviously stole a bunch of gear from our warehouse. Even though they likely didn't intend to hurt me, who knows what could have happened if they knew I was standing only a few feet from them, and without me ever getting a look at them. There's a chance they came fully armed and willing to do anything. Story 9. This happened last year, at the beginning of spring. We were experiencing a really rainy month, with pretty much some kind of downpour every day. whether light drizzle or full-on storms. I do deliveries for a popular restaurant in my area, so constant rain isn't ideal when I have to be running through it all the time to pick up and drop off orders. This night started like any other. I got to work at 6 and completed a couple of orders before getting one for a somewhat distant delivery. It was 10 miles out from our restaurant, heading into the more wooded part of town. It wasn't entirely forest or anything. It was just more spread out and less densely populated. The roads were often covered by trees and most neighborhoods weren't visible from the main roads. As I was driving, there was only one car behind me, not in a weird way, but that's just how empty the road was. But once I got maybe 2 miles in, a beam of someone's headlights suddenly appeared in front of me, revealing a car in the middle of the road, swerving to a stop. I slammed on my brakes, as the car was now sideways, blocking the entire road. The driver behind me did the same, stopping so close that I was surprised we didn't collide. After the initial seconds of shock, I looked up at the car in the middle of the road. It was a beat-up sedan, and its brights were on, making it too blinding to see who was in the car. I'd initially thought the driver might have been falling asleep at the wheel or just not paying attention, but it almost seemed like they had intentionally kept their headlights off until the very last second, when they swerved into the road. I didn't see where they came from. It was too dark, so I wasn't sure if they were just driving down the road or had emerged from the side. The car behind me laid on its horn, clearly frustrated by whatever this was. I probably should have been more skeptical, but in the moment when something this crazy happens, it's hard to think straight. Either way, the car behind me was too close for me to reverse, and the car in front was blocking the entire way forward, so I couldn't go anywhere unless one of them moved first. After a while of the guy behind me honking, he stopped and got out of his car. I looked in my mirror, seeing a large man begin walking through the rain. He looked furious as he walked right past my car and up to the other one. He stood at their window, angrily yelling at whoever was inside, but with the rain I could barely hear what he was saying, and I couldn't hear anything at all from the other person if they were even responding. I saw the man outside bang on the window a few times as he yelled, but then he suddenly stopped and went quiet. He slowly backed away from the window, then nervously walked back to his car. As he was getting into the driver's side door of the other car opened. A man stepped out, wearing a thick hoodie that covered most of his face. I was now getting really freaked out, and still had no way of leaving other than running out of my car and into the woods, which was probably a terrible idea. So I sat there and watched as the man quickly made his way up to the car behind me. But just as he got to the door, that car floored it backward. Their tires screeched as they slid against the pavement, losing control and sliding off the road. They made it past a few trees before eventually slamming into one further into the woods. The man who was still on the road turned and looked at my car, making eye contact with me in my side mirror. Horrified, I put my car in reverse and pressed on the gas, backing out past him, then turned around and sped off. I obviously called the police, but I still had no idea what was really going on there that night. An officer got to the scene about 15 minutes after I'd left, and the only thing there was the car wedged in the woods, against a tree. The other car was gone, and neither of the men were there. I think we can all assume what probably happened without even having any reasoning to go off of. But there are still a million questions that need answers. All I can say is that if the other guy behind me wasn't there, I likely would be in his place right now. Story 10. This only happened a few months ago. I recently moved into a very small, single-story house that was conveniently close to my job. I used to have to drive almost an hour every day, so this move was a welcome change. The only thing was, I'd never really spent any time in this area outside of work, so it felt like moving to a completely different place. Anyway, on this particular night, I got off at 6 p.m. and drove straight home. I had to work again the next day, so I wasn't planning on doing much. Probably just relaxing and eating for a bit, then heading to bed. I pulled into my garage and went inside, putting some leftover pizza in the oven to warm up. But while it was heating, my doorbell rang. It actually made me jump, because I hadn't heard the doorbell before, and I had no idea who would be there. I walked down to the front door and looked through the peephole. It was a woman, perhaps in her 50s, with long gray hair. I opened the door. "Hi, how can I help you?" She smiled broadly and said she'd noticed I'd moved in recently. We talked for a minute as she asked about where I came from, if I had a wife or kids, and all that kind of random small talk. Then she said goodnight and walked off. I never really got the chance to ask her who she even was, but I assumed she was just an older lady who lived down the block. Something about her, though, just felt off. I don't know how else to describe it, but I wasn't sure if there was actually something strange about her, or if it was just because she was old. I went back to the kitchen, got my pizza, then sat on the couch and started looking for a good video on YouTube to watch. I found some random commentary video to play as background noise while I ate, but only about 10 minutes passed before I noticed a sound from outside. I paused the TV and listened, realizing it was an idling car engine, and it was really loud. I got up and looked out the front window. There was a car parked right in front of my house. It was running, but all its headlights were off. I looked down both sides of the road, seeing the entire street was empty, with plenty of other places to park, yet they had chosen right in front of my house. I watched the car for a couple of minutes, but with no changes, I went back to the couch. A whole half hour went by with the car's engine still audibly running right outside the house, until it suddenly shut off. I paused the TV again and listened, not hearing anything else. After a minute, I got up and walked over to the window, looking out and seeing the car exactly as it was before, except it obviously wasn't running anymore. Again, nobody else was outside. It was just this one car. I shut the blinds just to make sure nobody was watching me for some reason. Then I went back to the couch and started cleaning up. But there was only a moment before a quiet thump sounded from the other side of the house. Already feeling a little on edge, I walked over to the hallway and looked down toward the kitchen. For a split second, I saw the shadow of someone walking away from the back door, as if they'd noticed me and were trying to hide. Their footsteps quickly ran around the house toward the front, and when I looked out the window, I saw a man getting inside the parked car and driving away immediately. The first thing I did was go to the back door and open it, trying to figure out why he was out there. It only took me a few seconds to notice that the handle on the outside was really loose, like they had been trying to take it off. Even just by pulling the flimsy handle a bit to the side, I could see the inner workings of the lock in the door, meaning he probably would have been able to unlock it. He was only moments away from getting inside my house. I can't say for certain if the old lady from before had anything to do with it. I know it sounds strange that she would, but I thought about the questions she was asking me, which all had to do with whether anyone else lived with me. Maybe she was gathering information to know if I was a good target for whatever they planned. It's been a few months since, and I've never seen her or the man again. Story 11. For the past decade, I've led a quiet life in Utah. I own a small cabin in a town where people generally live a similar lifestyle. There's a town center with shops and everything, but most people have cabins or houses a few miles out, with either farms or just plain land. I don't farm, but I do have a lot of grassy land that borders some mountains. This happened almost 10 months ago. It was around 8:00 p.m. one night, and I was sitting outside by my fire pit, working on my laptop. I did this almost every night, except when it was snowing. It was always a calming way to end the evening before bed. But this night was different. I'd been out there for about an hour, really focused on my laptop, when through the crackling campfire, I heard something in front of me. I lifted my head and saw a man standing on the other side of the flame, maybe 15 feet across from me. The man looked like a typical guy in his 40s who lived around here, big and rugged, with a large gray beard. I stood up from my chair. "What are you doing here? Where did you even come from?" I asked, trying to hide the shakiness in my voice. The man stared at me with a look I could only assume was that of someone about to do something terrible. But then he looked past me at my hat. I kept my gaze on him as he began walking toward the front of the cabin. He went up to one of the windows and quickly peered inside, muttering something under his breath as he turned and started to walk away. I called out again, asking what he was doing and throwing in some unfriendly words, but the guy just ignored me. He walked all the way to where the grass met the trees, and then he was gone. It was completely insane. Some random guy being out here right by my house was no accident, especially not at this time of night, and the way he was acting was beyond strange. It was like he was looking for something and had no fear of intruding on me. I put out the fire right away and went inside, locking up the cabin and getting my sidearm out, just in case. I didn't think he was gonna come back, but I wasn't sure about anything anymore. As for the police, calling them out here would take way too long to be a viable option if something were to happen. I was on my own, as that's just the way things are here. I stayed up for several more hours, long past my usual bedtime, and kept my eyes and ears open for anything. I don't remember the exact time, but it had to be at least 1 Aldrin AM, maybe even 2 Aldrin AM, when I finally passed out on the couch. I was trying my hardest to stay awake, but it just didn't happen. When I woke up though, there was an unusual constant sound, wind blowing through the house. I sat up, still confused and tired, and looked over at the front door. It was wide open. I jumped up and ran to the door, looking outside in all directions, but not seeing anything in the dark. I slammed it shut and locked it, then turned around to face the possibility of someone being inside my house. I stood there by the door for an entire minute, listening for any sounds of someone being inside. It was a small cabin, so even something like heavy breathing might be loud enough to hear, but it was dead silent, only the creaking of the wood from the wind outside. I slowly stepped through the hallway and into each room, checking every corner and opening every door, but nobody was inside. After that, I stayed up all night, and as soon as the sun came up, I drove into town and filed a report with the police, assuming that the man I'd seen that night was likely the one who'd broken into my cabin. The one issue with all of it is the motive. There were a few odd things missing, which meant he definitely had broken in and walked around the house while I was passed out. But nothing they took was worth any real value. And of course, they didn't harm me either. So what they intended is still undetermined, and without knowing why they came to my cabin, there's no telling whether or not they'll come back. Story 12. Staying up late was a regular requirement for my job, and I always found it hard to maintain focus once I started getting tired. Anyway, I was working in my office, and around 11:00 p.m., there was a knock at the front door. I got up and looked down the hallway. I couldn't imagine why anyone would be at my door at this hour. I walked to the other end of the house and peered through the peephole, but there was no one outside on my porch. I took a step back, thinking that maybe it hadn't actually been the front door. I was so engrossed in my work and on the opposite side of the house, so when I heard the soft knocking sound, I just assumed it was someone at the door. I didn't know what else it could have been, but I simply went back to my office and resumed working. Perhaps I should have been more concerned about the source of the knock, but I was so tired and eager to finish my work that it didn't even cross my mind. After a few minutes, I continued typing away on the computer for the better part of an hour. Nothing else seemed to happen regarding the knocking, but I was getting exponentially more tired by the minute. My workflow was slowing, and my eyes were growing heavy. Just as I was about to call it a night, I reached for my tea, and right in the window across the room, a pair of eyes stared back at me. All I could tell in that split second was that it was a man, but he quickly ran away from the window after I saw him. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I just sat there, eyes locked on the window. It was so unexpected that I was almost in a daze. After a moment, I stood up and ran to cover the window. I didn't know who that was or why he was looking into my house like that, but with it being almost midnight, it made it all the more terrifying. I left my office and went to the front of the house, looking out the peephole again to see if they'd gone to my front yard, but I didn't see him. I then went to a window at the back of the house and looked around, but again, there was no one out there. My adrenaline was pumping, and I was not tired at all anymore. But the now silent house was starting to freak me out. Had the man left, or was he still outside? I went back to my office, got my phone, then started making my way back to the front door. My plan was to call the police while keeping my eyes on the doors, and windows. But as I got to the end of the hallway, I was met by a large figure standing in the back of the living room. He was tall and wearing thick clothes to hide his identity, but his eyes were not the same as the ones I'd seen in the window. This was someone else. The man didn't hesitate, charging across the room at me. I turned and ran back to my office, locking the door behind me and pressing my body against it, preparing for them to try kicking it down. As they approached the door, though, they slowed to a stop and just stood right outside. I could hear them breathing, then starting to walk back and forth as if they were pacing in the hallway. But then I heard it again, a soft knocking sound on the other side of the house. The man outside my door started to walk down the hallway, back toward the living room. Then it was silent for a few minutes, as I stayed there, pressed against the door. There was absolutely nothing. I called the police, whispering into my phone and begging them to come quickly. I waited for about 5 minutes before I heard sirens approaching my house. As they unlocked my front door and came in, there were no altercations. I heard them walk through the house and finally up to my door, but they never saw either of the men. To this day, I still don't know how the one man got in, or what the two of them were trying to do. I think the knocking was their way of communicating from inside and outside the house. But then that makes me question what the first knock was that I heard. The whole situation freaks me out every time I think about it, wondering how long the one had been watching me for, and how long the other man had been inside my house. It could have ended up so much worse for me. So I know I got lucky, but it's hard not to think about the possibility of them coming back, and luck isn't what I want to rely on for my safety. Story 13. I'd just gotten home from work and was settling onto the couch with a movie. It was storming outside, and since it was Friday, what better to do than stay up late and watch some TV? I had the window curtains open, hoping to catch some cool sights if any lightning started up. It doesn't rain very often where I live, so nights like these are rare and always get me excited. But as the night progressed, just around midnight, I noticed something outside my window. Across the street, there was a man walking down the sidewalk. He had no hood or coat on and was completely soaked, but he walked up to one of the houses and onto their porch. I couldn't see too much through the rain and darkness, but it looked like he was waiting for them to answer the door. After a minute, he walked back down to the sidewalk and continued further down the street. I couldn't see any further, but witnessing that gave me an uneasy feeling. At this time of night and in this kind of weather, it just wasn't normal to be walking around and approaching people's houses. I closed the curtains by the window, just so that if he did come to my house, he wouldn't see me inside and expect me to answer the door. But only 15 minutes passed before there was a sound outside my house. Someone was walking up my driveway and onto my front porch. But there was no knock or doorbell. I heard them moving around, walking across my porch and near one of the windows, then going back to the door. By now I was really confused and wanted to look out the peephole, but I was worried they'd hear me. I waited, and after a minute, there were no more sounds. I quietly walked up to the door and looked. It was the man I'd seen earlier, and he was still there, standing at the edge of my porch, staring at the door with a blank face. I watched him for a few seconds before I got really creeped out and backed away. It was now that I started to think calling the police would be worth it, especially if he was going around to other people's houses and doing the same thing. I turned to get my phone, but then there was the sound of footsteps departing. I looked out again, and he was gone. After giving it some thought, I felt that this was still too creepy not to inform the police about. Whatever that man was doing was not normal. I called and let them know about it. They said they would send an officer to patrol the neighborhood and see if they could get the man to stop or explain what he was doing, but that was about all that could be done at the time. I thanked them, then hung up and checked out the door one more time before going back to the couch. The whole thing had really worn me out though, taking away the relaxing night and just making me exhausted. I shut everything off and went upstairs to get in bed. But as I got in and turned off the lights, A thump sounded from downstairs. I sat up, and then it came again. It was loud, like someone smashing something against the wall. I got up and ran to the top of the stairs, and now hearing it for the third time, I realized it was at the front. Someone was hitting something against it, like they were trying to forcefully break it down. I walked down a few steps and looked over, seeing the door violently shake every time they hit it. It looked like they were just a few hits away from breaking it down. Now, absolutely terrified, I locked myself in the bedroom and called the police again. The operator said that an officer was already in the neighborhood and would be here in just a minute. But through their voice, I heard wood shatter and the door slam against the ground. Footsteps quickly moved through the downstairs, going into every room without stopping. Then they began moving up the stairs, but were cut off by the officer pulling in and running up to the house. The intruder immediately stopped and ran for the back door as the officer came in and yelled at him. Apparently they had trouble getting the back door open in the heat of the moment, so the officer was able to get him down and into the car. The man, who looked like a psycho up close, refused to say anything, not even a single word, before they drove him off. His intentions were clear though. He was carrying a heavy hammer and had a bunch of zip ties in his pocket. That doesn't exactly sound like a coincidence, considering what he was doing. Why he chose to go for my house isn't clear though, but what likely saved me was calling the police that first time. If I hadn't, the officer wouldn't have been in the neighborhood so close by, and likely would have gotten here too late for me to have ever been seen again. Story 14. I work 4 days a week on 10 to 12-hour overnight shifts, which means I have to sleep during the day and be awake at night for at least 4 days a week. However, constantly changing my sleep schedule on my days off usually led to much worse sleep and left me feeling exhausted. So, I started sticking to the same schedule all week. I'd typically go to bed around noon and wake up at 8:00 p.m. It was hard to get used to, but I had to do it for work, and after a few months, it wasn't too terrible. On one of my days off a few months ago, I got up at 9 a.m., had breakfast, did some chores, then went out for a run just before midnight. This was a fairly normal day off for me. Sometimes I'd have lazy days, but for the most part, I'd try to go for a run within the first few hours of my day. My house is right next to a forest preserve, so I take the same path every time. It's basically just a big loop inside the preserve, and I'll go around it as many times as I need before I feel like I'm done. I started along this trail, completing 2 full loops before a man appeared on the path. When I first noticed him, he was too far down the path to clearly see, but it looked like he was just walking. As I started to get closer though, I realized he wasn't moving. He was wearing a dark sweatshirt and baggy pants, facing my direction as I approached him. When I passed by, he slowly moved his head to follow me, as if he was watching. I looked back and saw him still standing there. It freaked me out and made me think for a couple of minutes, but when I looped around again, he was gone. I don't know if maybe he took a shortcut through the woods, but the exit was on the opposite side from where he was standing, and he definitely didn't pass me on the path. His strange appearance and disappearance gave me a bad feeling, causing me to cut my run short and head home. I left the forest and jogged through the street to house. When I got inside, I chugged some water and sat down, only to be startled by a sound right outside my front door. It was almost 1:00 a.m., so nobody should have been at my house. I walked up and looked through the peephole. A man was on my porch, and I recognized him from his dark sweatshirt as the same man from the forest preserve. I felt my stomach drop as I watched him just stand there. He didn't knock or ring the doorbell. I must have watched him for a whole minute, seeing the man do nothing more than glance around a few times. I started to get really creeped out, thinking about how he had to have followed me home and was clearly not behaving normal. I walked back to my kitchen and quietly dialed 911, telling them about a possible stalker outside my house. After reporting it, I went back to the door, and the man was still there. He stood in the same place, glancing around and never knocking or anything for the next 10 minutes. Even when the police car pulled up, he didn't run. He acted like nothing was wrong and gave no explanation for what he was doing at my house or why he followed me. Almost equally terrifying, they couldn't actually hold the guy under arrest because he hadn't really done anything yet. It was clear his behavior was off and something was wrong with him, but it wasn't enough to do anything about it. I don't know why that guy followed me and creepily stood outside my house, but with him behaving the way he was, I wouldn't doubt it if he had something horrible in mind.